2010 was also the year that Star Tours at Disney's theme parks was closed down in order to make room for its successor. Lucas himself was heavily involved in the development of Star Tours, The Adventure Continues. But it was while he was working on this, as Lucas personally attended to the project, that a man from out of the past returned to tempt Lucas with a bold offer of his own.
I sense something, a presence I've not felt since...
The one who met Lucas that fateful day was Robert Iger, the executive who had given Young Idiots' chance on ABC 20 years earlier. Now, before delving into what happened, I think it's important to back up a moment and look at what happened during the years as Lucas went down his path of making the prequels and Robert Iger went down his own, to understand a bit about the man who approached Lucas on that day, and to see how those events might have shaped Lucas's own perspectives. It's also important to serve as a counterpoint to Lucas. Pretty much everyone knows the name George Lucas and likely has an impression. But how many people have even heard of Robert Iger, let alone given him the same kind of scrutiny that Lucas has been under? Before we get to the deal that would forever change Star Wars, let's take a moment to see. Iger is said to have made a concerted effort to change in the face of this rebuke. Inside reports said that Iger's concerns were nevertheless real. Eisner was paranoid about being ousted, but of particular importance because Disney was a corporation that had grown from a central creator. So, naturally, given his circumstances, this was all of interest to him, especially when it involved Roy E. Disney himself. We are a company whose roots are completely in the creative end of the world. We were a little studio that just made animated films. There was nothing there but creative people. I grew up in this atmosphere. The company needs to trust its creative employees. So you can see the relevance here to Lucas, who had always felt that a corporation could lose sight of its creative mission. It was the reason that he had consolidated in the early 80s. What was playing out with Disney was a warning of what Lucasfilm could one day become if they lost sight of what they were doing. Especially when Roy spoke before the shareholders and echoed a Time review about the original Star Wars, you might recall. It's made for kids, the kid in everybody. Well, Disney told the shareholders, our mission has always been to be the bringers of joy, to be framed of the good in each of us, to be teachers, to speak, as Walt once put it, not to children, but to the child in each of us. This is the core of what we have claimed to call Disney. Eisner was finally forced to step down, and although Iger was frequently linked to Eisner by the Save Disney camp, the two sides agreed to put aside their differences as Iger stepped in to replace him. He was met with skepticism, but that didn't last long. His second day on the job, he addressed the concerns about the floundering animation department with an unexpected proposal. Disney should buy Pixar. As he noted, none of Disney's recent animated creations were catching on. When he saw the opening celebration for Hong Kong Disneyland and it was populated by Pixar characters, it seemed rather obvious where Disney was finding its success. With the board's approval, he approached Steve Jobs personally to discuss the issue, and after winning over Jobs' confidence, purchased the company for $7.4 billion. Jobs had been emphatic that maintaining the culture at Pixar was essential to ensuring its continued success, which Iger assured him would happen. Now, this was a twofold success. Not only did Pixar continue, with a few exceptions, to excel, but the approach also impressed Lucas. Seeing that it could be absorbed into the Disney empire while retaining its soul pleased its original creator, and would remain in the back of his mind whenever the subject of Disney came up. 3 years after the Pixar acquisition, Iger also spearheaded the purchase of Marvel Entertainment for $4 billion. If you followed my look at comic books, then you know two things about its owner, Ike Perlmutter. He's a cheapskate, and he is extraordinarily cautious when it comes to business. The business success that followed Pixar's acquisition was really the only thing that got Iger in the door. Again, though, it was for a face-to-face meeting that they held in order to discuss matters personally. With Steve Jobs to back up what he was saying, Iger finally convinced Perlmutter to make the sale. Once again, the company's leadership remained intact, allowing the product to continue without interruption. This move was successful in an entirely new way. Not only was Disney gaining the assets and utilizing them the same way as Pixar, but it earned some street cred within geek culture circles that Disney wasn't going to take over products and change them in order to fit the Disney image, or disrupt them and hurt the product. This kind of thing had happened all the time over at Marvel thanks to the intrusion of outside businessmen into the world of comics. But we were seeing that a Disney acquisition didn't mean that the day-to-day operations were going to be changed. It only meant that the company now owned Marvel's IP and could find additional ways of using it. This had been the heart of Iger's new philosophy, that what Disney needed to bounce back was to expand its intellectual property, to have a stable of timeless characters, which was what made Disney as a company able to survive for so long. These could then be used in other ways, like using Pixar-related characters in theme parks, or making Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for ABC to tie into their successful Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so, as Lucas was personally supervising work on the new Star Tours attraction, Iger approached him for a breakfast meeting at one of the Disney World restaurants, closed specifically for this meeting. Iger asked how he would feel about selling his company to Disney. Lucas mulled it over and said he wasn't ready to do that right now, but in time he might talk to Iger. He felt that if Disney took over, that it would be in safe hands. While 20th Century Fox had worked with them for decades, ultimately they were a film production company, while Disney had had nearly 90 years' experience in fully utilizing intellectual property. Star Wars was just another thing that 20th Century Fox could make movies about, and it could fall out of favor and vanish at some point. But very rarely did Disney allow one of its creations to languish in obscurity for long. During this time, Lucas approached Kathleen Kennedy. The two had been friends for decades, her having started as Steven Spielberg's secretary before rapidly becoming one of Hollywood's leading producers. She'd worked with Lucas on the Indiana Jones films as well, and with her unquestionable reputation, Lucas felt that he could ask her to do a vital job, co-chair Lucasfilm with him, with the intention that she would be his successor when the time came. Word was quickly sent out with a statement with remarks from Lucas, Kennedy, and even Spielberg. I've spent my life building Lucasfilm, and as I shift my focus into other directions, I wanted to make sure it was in the hands of someone equipped to carry my vision into the future. It was important that my successor not only be someone with great creative passion and proven leadership abilities, but also someone who loves movies. I care deeply about my employees. It is their creativity and hard work that has made this company what it is today. As the company grows and expands, I wanted to be sure the employees of Lucasfilm have a strong captain for the ship. I also cared deeply about our fans, and it was important to have someone who would carry on the passion and care that I've given the films over the years. So for me, Kathy was the obvious choice. She is a trusted friend and one of the most respected producers and executives in the industry. Lucas was sure things were in safe hands, and was considering the offer by Iger. Nothing concrete, but just the idea of it. And yet sometimes the thought of that weighed heavily on him. Kennedy admitted that some days when she asked how he was doing, his response implied that he himself wasn't sure if, after devoting 40 years to this and all that it had entailed, after tearing his life apart to build it, that he was ready to just walk away. Lawrence Kasdan was asked to return in a purely consulting role, given his grasp of what made Star Wars work. And given how vital the presence of classic characters would be, Lucas also personally reached out to Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford about the possibility of returning. They couldn't do much with the story without knowing what characters could and couldn't appear, after all. Lucas also contacted Iger at Disney and began a 5-month negotiation. He explained his main concern, that his people knew Star Wars, that if this went forward, Disney needed to leave it in their hands. Iger understood the concern, and Pixar and Marvel had shown that Disney was trying not to interfere with the mechanics that had made their acquisition a success. But at the same time, it was made clear to Lucas that if Disney bought the company, it had to have the final say. Lucas, who had never liked the idea of having others control his work, struggled with this thought. And that wasn't all. Disney heard about the Star Wars sequel trilogy and asked to see what he had. He said they were rough sketches. They asked to see that. He said something along the lines of, "Trust me, they're great. You're buying my ideas as much as my company. If you don't have faith in me, I'll sell it to someone else." Eventually, Lucas got, in writing, a broad outline of the deal, and was willing to show a copy of the treatment to Iger and 2 other top executives, but agreed in writing not to share them with anyone else. Iger said they saw the story potential, and with that both Disney and Lucas were confident with this deal. Nevertheless, as the end of October neared and Lucas was given the contract to sign, he had trouble hiding his grief. He didn't hesitate when the moment arrived, but signing away the company that had been the center of his life for so long was no easy thing for the man. The news shocked the world, but the Marvel situation had made it palatable to fans who otherwise might have been nervous as to what Disney would do with the beloved property. And news of another Star Wars revival was met with excitement, with fans quick to assemble guidelines for the films to follow to be a success and avoid perceived mistakes with the prequels. Meanwhile, Lucas remained for story meetings to discuss the rules of his universe and to provide input. Like Steve Jobs, who passed away a year before the acquisition, and Ike Perlmutter, Lucas was now a huge stakeholder in Disney. Now, if you thought it was difficult enough sorting out fact from rumor from fabrication in the cloistered halls of Lucasfilm, now add Disney into the mix. A book by J.W. Rinsler that was made during production of Episode 7 that was to be the definitive behind-the-scenes look at that film was mysteriously pulled from release without explanation. At the time this video is being created, there are no signs that the book will ever see the light of day. With the success of his previous behind-the-scenes Star Wars books and the ever-growing popularity of the franchise, this move is inexplicable, with only 2 likely possibilities. Either there is something in the book that could be legally harmful, and there is disagreement on how to remedy it, doubtful given that over a year passed, and a release could have taken advantage of the hype around Episode 8 to increase sales, so the fact that no action was taken would be dubious. That leaves the only other likely explanation, which is there is something in the book harmful to the image of either Disney, Lucasfilm, or someone important within one of those companies, something they don't want the public to know about. What we do know for certain is that the work Lucas had already done for Episode 7, which Iger had publicly praised, was somehow no longer viable. A not insignificant number of fans voiced views that it was Disney saving us from a repeat of the disastrous prequel trilogy, but this is only speculation, and given what little we do know, questionable. We know that the Luke Skywalker plot of Episode 8 was in fact drawn from Lucas's plans for Episode 7, but it was also significantly changed. Given some limited but nevertheless loud fan response, it is therefore possible that the one part of Lucas's treatment is what people hated, but it's equally, if not more likely, that they took what fans would have liked and rescued it by turning it into something they hated. But again, we don't know. Whatever the case, it's far more likely that Disney wasn't unhappy with the treatment so much as the fact that they wanted the first Star Wars movie to hit certain marks. In other words, to be what critics described as safe. After all, their plans did hinge on more than just doing another trilogy, but rather in turning Star Wars into an ongoing film and television franchise. A badly received first film could doom the $4 billion deal's value right away. Whatever the reason, Lucas clearly felt he had been betrayed, which is why I feel exploring the professional experience of the man who persuaded him to make that deal was so important. While this could indeed be a case of Disney saving the world from George Lucas's latest folly, it doesn't change the fact that Iger praised the treatment to Lucasfilm and the public, and then it was thrown away. It could be that he was being honest and just completely off the mark. He is on the management side of things, after all. But the decision to do so, to abandon Lucas's treatment, was made before J.J. Abrams was even brought in to begin developing Episode 7. In other words, before the creative forces became involved in the film. So we have to also concede the possibility that Tom Murphy, in fact, was right, and Iger had lost his soul, and told Lucas what he wanted to hear to ensure the deal went through. That's not an accusation. We just don't know. And in the deliberate silence of Disney, all we can do is speculate. In an interview with Charlie Rose, where Lucas was trying to explain why he walked away after that you have to move on, he allowed his mood to slip briefly when he said that the Star Wars films were his children, which he cared for. When Rose interrupted, saying children he sold, Lucas continued the analogy before realizing the implication of what he was saying, bitterly noting that he'd sold them to white slavers. He quickly walked that back, but there was no denying that Lucas was still bitter over what had happened.